continue on in our study of Matthew. And of course, we're making our way very slowly and ploddingly through his 7th section, which is understandable given this is where the fullness of the gospel is really playing out. But still, we have a long way to go before we get through all of this. So this final section covers the final 3 chapters of Matthew, so 26, 27, and 28. And in this section, we see Jesus with sovereign humility, murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins, and resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. And I know what the song we just sang is trying to do, but it always kind of pains me that they just kind of stop with him dead, because there's more past that is really, really important and makes everything else worthwhile. So I understand what the song's trying to do, but it always feels like there should be another verse. But he is resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. But we're not there yet. We're still working through these things. And as I've outlined the 7th section, I've got a few different portions in there, and we're now targeting the 2nd portion, which I have said is dedicated perhaps more so than other of these portions to the humiliation of Christ. That is just treating him in these ways, much like we sang about just a few minutes ago. But his humiliation, by that I mean humiliation is to be treated worse than you think you deserve, to the point that it causes you great sorrow and shame. And in the case of Christ, that all happens as he is arrested and abandoned and put on trial. And you could certainly talk about his crucifixion in similar terms, because that's meant to be a very humiliating death. But when we get to the crucifixion, some other things come to the center stage. So here and now in Matthew's gospel is where his humiliation really comes to the forefront. And so far in all of that, we have seen Jesus arrested. And we finally got through the scene in the garden where he was arrested. And we're ready now to move on to other things, specifically the trial of Jesus. Or we might say the trials of Jesus, because there's a few of them. And I will probably go back and forth in whether I say trial or trials. Don't worry about it. There's a lot happening. That's all you need to know. So our passage today records the late night trial of Jesus before the high priest and the Sanhedrin court, which was the supreme court in Jerusalem. So whenever I say the Sanhedrin, I'm talking about the most influential and most powerful court there in Jerusalem. So let's read this passage. Matthew 26, I'm going to read verses 57 through 68. So it says this: "Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus, so they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward and said, 'This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.' The high priest stood up and said to him, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God.' Jesus said to him, 'You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They answered, 'He deserves death.' Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you?' So I'm sure you'll not be surprised to learn that I have about 6 sermons planned for this passage. As of this morning, the number went up to 6, although the good news is I have pretty much exhausted what I think is even remotely possible for me to talk about in this passage, at least with my current level of understanding. So I'm pretty sure 6 is the number. Although 7 would be a more perfect number. I might just round up, you never know. But nonetheless, I've got quite a few sermons planned for this passage, and true to form for everything else we've been studying, there is a lot here to talk about. My sermon today is mainly going to review the overall attitude of Jesus during this late night trial before the high priest and the Sanhedrin. So kind of painting with a very broad brush here and just looking at how Jesus responds to all of this. And my sermon today is called The Patience of the Saints. And here is a deliberate plural, saints, at the very end of there. I want this to be the patience of the saints because my goal is to display the patience of Jesus during his unjust trial as an example of patience for us to follow. So talking about Jesus, but trying to talk about us as well, or at least what God expects of us, and to put it more positively, what is possible for us. Now my outline today has 3 headings, and each of these headings will focus on some aspect of Jesus being humiliated at his trial, because really all of this whole thing is just an absolute disgrace, and it'd be an embarrassment for anyone to be subjected to this. So it's very much part of his humiliation, but all of that just underscores his great patience. You know, for someone enduring the things he is enduring, he is taking it remarkably well, and as such becomes an example for us to follow, for us to imitate. So I'm really trying to go for that angle. But here are the 3 headings I have in mind. First, Christ was humiliated by all of the dignitaries in Jerusalem. Now, I want to explain the wording that I'm using there, a dignitary, just in case that's not readily apparent what I mean. A dignitary is someone who is well known and has influence over other people. So if everyone knows your name and people tend to do what you say, you're probably a dignitary. And there are probably levels of dignitary as well. But nonetheless, if you were a dignitary of any kind in Jerusalem, you were probably involved in shaming Jesus during his trial. And I just want to lay that out for you. Secondly, Christ was humiliated by lesser men judging him. And of course, to state the obvious, all men are lesser men compared to Jesus. We know that for a fact. But some men are much lesser than Jesus. And the men that are gathering here and will gather against him in later passages are most certainly lesser men than Jesus, who don't deserve the amount of authority they have over him or think they have over him at this moment. Nonetheless, here we are, seeing lesser men standing in judgment over him. Excuse me. Third heading, last one. Christ was humiliated by slander. Now, slander, to keep defining my terms here, slander is anything said about a person which is not true, but which is said about a person anyway to make them look bad. All right, so just give you a very informal definition of slander. The evidence brought against Jesus at his trial is basically slander. All right, it's false testimony, to use the more legal term. But it's all presented against him just to tear him down. And we're going to talk about that in the third heading. Now, perhaps all of that is familiar. We're not exactly breaking any new ground on any of these things. And my application is not entirely original either, the idea that we should be imitating Christ. So far all of this is Christianity 101. But I want to at least add some detail to these thoughts. And there are some things here up front that can be said that maybe are not readily apparent to everyone, and so perhaps worth saying. And I think overall will, in some sense, deepen our admiration for Christ, and for that same reason, make it all the more appealing to actually be like him, which again is the ultimate point of this sermon, to present him as an example for us to imitate in his patience under this kind of humiliation that he endures. So with all of that in mind as a goal, let's go ahead and start moving through the passage in broad strokes, covering some of these very basic ideas. The first being that Christ was humiliated by all the dignitaries in Jerusalem. Again, anyone who was anybody is involved in the trials of Jesus there in Jerusalem. And I just want to spend some time talking about that and the implications of that. So I need to do two things overall as I talk about this. First, I need to give you an overview of all the courtroom trials of Jesus, because there's a lot of them, and true to form, the four Gospels kind of pick and choose what parts of it they want to share, so you got to put them all together. I want to give you an overview of all that. The second thing I need to do is introduce you to the dignitaries, the cast of characters, or at least the groups to which they belong. So all of that is necessary to give you an idea of what I mean by Christ being humiliated by all the dignitaries in Jerusalem. And the good news is I can do all of that in kind of overlapping steps. So I can basically just give you a very brief version of all the trials of Jesus, and along the way I can tell you who's involved in that, and that should give you a very full understanding of who is involved in all of this and what they're doing. So let's trace this through 6 steps. So yes, if you heard of lengthy legal battles, well, this is a 6-stage trial, or 6 trials if you want to call it that way. So as for where the trials of Jesus begin, they actually begin with something only mentioned by John in his gospel, and that is the interview with Annas. So this is only recorded by John. If you like homework, I'll give you some homework. John chapter 18, verse 12 is where you can read about that. It's very brief, but it is there and it is mentioned. Now, for those of you wondering who is Annas, Annas had been high priest. So you might say he is a former high priest. The thing is, the Romans had removed Annas from his position as high priest 2 decades earlier. So he hasn't held that office for like 20 years. And you say, well, can the Romans do that? Well, no, but the Romans are the Romans, so they do what they want. And they removed him from office 2 decades before this point. Nonetheless, Annas was still very influential. As proof of just how much influence he had, 5 sons of Annas and one of his sons-in-law eventually all became high priests. So it's still in his family, and he's the top dog in his own family, so like Annas is still very influential. Now, the fact that Jesus was brought to Annas's house as the first stage of his trial should sound very shady to you. I mean, this is like underworld type stuff. This is like Godfather type stuff. And if you don't know that movie, don't worry about it. But it's like that kind of thing. Like, this is not how justice is supposed to work. They don't arrest you and take you to some guy's house in the middle of the night. This is not above board. Okay, this is not how the justice system is supposed to work. Nonetheless, it makes sense because Annas really was the puppet master there in Jerusalem, and Jesus went to Annas first. We don't have a lot of information about what happened there, but stuff happened there. Okay, that's number 1 phase. Second phase of the unjust trial is later that night, that same night when Jesus was arrested, when Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court there in Jerusalem. Now, all 4 Gospels record this phase, so this is something that everyone saw fit to mention, although some are very brief. Some don't go into a lot of detail on it, but it is mentioned by all 4 Gospels. Matthew gives us a good amount of detail, and that's the passage we just read a few minutes ago. Again, the Sanhedrin was the highest court of the Jews. So if you're working your way through the legal system there in Jerusalem or anywhere in Judea, and you follow it all the way to the top is the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin is composed of 3 groups or chambers, and you might call them, in their own way, they're even political parties, but there are 3 divisions of the Sanhedrin. The first of these chambers is the priesthood in charge of the temple. So the guys involved in all the sacrifices and those kinds of things, they're represented in the Sanhedrin. The second chamber was made up of the scribes, who were the experts in the law of Moses and teachers in the synagogues and the brains behind the Pharisees. So if you're wondering where the Pharisees get all the stuff they believe, they got it from the scribes. The scribes were allegedly getting it from the law of Moses, although that's highly dubious, as we've seen Jesus point out quite a few times overall. But nonetheless, the scribes are represented in the Sanhedrin. And the third chamber of the Sanhedrin was composed of elders, which is a very generic term for anyone who is of great age and influence in Jerusalem. Basically, if everyone thinks you deserve a seat of power and you're not a priest and you're not a scribe, you're an elder. Congratulations, you've made it to the top. So that's the third chamber of the Sanhedrin. Now, in charge of the entire Sanhedrin was the high priest, who at that time was Caiaphas, who is the son-in-law of Annas. So I mentioned earlier that one of his sons-in-law eventually became high priest. That's Caiaphas, and he's the guy in charge of the Sanhedrin at this time. So when I say that all the dignitaries in Jerusalem were part of the humiliation of Christ, the Sanhedrin makes up most of that. We've got the priesthood, we've got the scribes, we've got the elders, we've got the high priest. You know, they're all there. Now, after that late night trial before the Sanhedrin, we've got a third phase of all of this. Jesus would actually stand before them all again the very next morning for an official verdict against him. And that's the third phase of things. So I don't know how much he slept that night, but I'm sure some of them slept. But they got up early next morning, and they basically did the same thing all over again in a more official way. And we'll get more into that later, why they did it again. But nonetheless, that's the third phase of things, the early morning repeat trial before the Sanhedrin. Later that same morning, we have the fourth phase, and this would be Jesus going before Pontius Pilate. And of course, as his name very much implies, he is the Roman authority there. He is the Roman governor over Judea at this point. And so at this time, we're switching from Jewish dignitaries to a Roman one. You know, since Pilate is the governor appointed by the Romans over Judea, which is all the area around Jerusalem. If you ever hear me say Judea, it's all the area that's around Jerusalem, kind of in the southern part of Israel. Pilate was the guy over all of that as appointed by the Romans. So now we've switched to Gentile authorities. We got a Roman guy taking part in the humiliation of Jesus. And that's the fourth phase. Now the thing is, as Pilate found out, as he was perhaps for a time relieved to find out, Jesus was not from Judea. He was from Galilee, which is the northern part of Israel, which means Pilate had no jurisdiction over him technically. So, for that reason, Pilate sent Jesus off to somebody else. And this, of course, is Herod Antipas, who was appointed by the Romans over Galilee and Perea, I believe. And he was a tetrarch, which means ruler of a fourth. If you're wondering how a man becomes the ruler of a fourth part of a nation, it's very easy. You have a father who ruled the entire nation, who then died and had his kingdom split up between 4 sons, and you got 1/4 of it. So not a very illustrious position, but still a man with some amount of authority. Herod Antipas was one of the sons of Herod the Great, who became ruler of part of Herod's kingdom after Herod's death, and that happens to be the part where Jesus was from, Galilee. So upon this phase of Jesus' trial, Jesus would stand before Herod Antipas all that same morning. All of this is happening all at once. All these people happen to be in Jerusalem at the same time, so it just works out that way. But that's the fifth phase of his trial. Only Luke mentions that. Only Luke mentions that Jesus stood before Herod at some point. And then finally, phase number 6, again, I told you this was a lot, but finally, Herod refused to make a ruling. So what do? You go back to Pilate, say, hey, look, Herod's not doing anything. You're the only guy. Let's do something. So you go back to Pilate. Pilate orders the crucifixion of Jesus. And all 4 Gospels record that because, of course, that's very important. So here at the end of all of that complicated process of the trials of Jesus, we might ask the question, whom did Jesus not see during his trial? I mean, we've got priests, we've got guys who used to be high priest and are now in charge of basically controlling everything from the shadows. We've got scribes, we've got elders, we've got a Roman governor, we've got kind of this half-Jewish Roman client, 1/4 of a king named Herod. I mean, it's like, who is not involved in all of this? Pretty much anyone who is anybody there in Jerusalem. If you were a dignitary in Jerusalem at that time, you were a part of this. You were a part of the trial of Jesus. And at this point, I think we can make a comparison between the situation of Christ and our own situation. The situation just of Christians, maybe a bit more generally. As Christians, the dignitaries of the world are in some sense entirely against us. We very much find ourselves in a situation where if we were to visually represent what we face in the world around us, the scene would look a lot like Jesus, standing in the middle of this crowd of people who have all the power and all the influence, and here we are just kind of taking it. Politicians, rich people, celebrities, YouTube people, just like everyone seems to some degree very hostile to what we're teaching in the gospel, because in some sense they are hostile. And it's the kind of thing that we endure just in any phase in which we're trying to take part in the world around us. Now, if we know the teachings of Jesus, that's no surprise. We see here at the end of his ministry, the ultimate show of that, but really, this is how it has been throughout, and he even warned his disciples about this at some point earlier. Just to read briefly from Matthew chapter 10, verse 24, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, Satan, how much more will they malign the members of his household?" So if they're going to do this stuff to me, they're definitely going to do it to you, is the warning Jesus gives. So again, not much of a surprise. But here's another truth that applies both to Jesus and also to us, because we are, of course, very much sort of riding in the train of Jesus on his way to glory and victory. But Psalm 2, listen to the tone of Psalm 2 and how it talks about the Messiah. It says, "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed," the Messiah, "saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. Well, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance, and the ends of the earth as your possession. And you shall break them with a rod of iron, and shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry, lest you perish in the way. For soon his wrath may be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. So the psalm, very much talks about the nations and the kings and the judges of those nations being gathered against the Messiah. And we see that very much literally come to pass in the trials of Jesus. But how does that end? I mean, from their perspective, it ends with him dead. In reality, it ends with him very much alive and risen up above all their rule and all their authority to the point where they are now commanded to serve him. And of course, we're on his side. So I relay that to you just in the same way that I think this would have been an encouragement to Jesus. Whatever he is thinking about during his trial, I have to think he was calling to his mind the promises of God regarding himself and his eventual victory. And we too, in the middle of all that, even if the whole world really is arrayed against us and all the rich and the powerful are against us, in the end, we have the same victory he has because we're with him. So Jesus displays composure and faith and patience during his trial, despite all leveled against him, and we therefore can too, since we share the same destiny that he does, being gathered together at the right hand of God, very much safe, very much secure, very much in glory. So that's the first part of things we can talk about from the trial of Jesus, his response, and what we can get from it. For my second heading today, I want to focus on how Christ would have been humiliated in being judged by lesser men. So moving on now, not just the cast of characters, but the quality of these characters and what sort of men they are and what we can say about that. Now, before I go any further, I just want to say, it's worth saying, it's kind of implied, but it's worth saying out loud, that history has vindicated what I just said about the men who condemned Jesus to death, that they are lesser men. Pretty much, you look at the whole course of history, and anyone that knows anything about history, you're not exactly going to find anyone who disagrees with me. Of the dozens of men directly involved in executing Jesus, we know only a few of their names. We know Annas, we know Caiaphas, we know Pilate, Herod. We know 4 guys out of all the dozens of them that were at some point involved in all of this. History has not bothered to even remember the names of most of these men. They have not made it into the who's who of history. They may have been the who's who of Jerusalem, but history doesn't care about any of these guys at all. Also, you would need to search far and wide to find someone who would dare support the verdicts of these judges. In fact, I don't even know of anyone who would support. Maybe you can find somebody who would say it was worth doing, but by and large, no one says what happened to Jesus was 100% correct. It was pure justice. You're just not going to find that. Even modern Jews are not so keen on saying that Jesus was worthy of execution. It's just not the kind of thing that is believed anymore. So in the terms of writing this story, the Sanhedrin and Pilate and all those guys, they are the undisputed villains of the story. There's not even anyone that would argue otherwise. And of course, we have on the other side of all of this, on the other side of the scales, the character and the deeds and the legacy of Jesus himself, untarnished, beloved by millions, right? And, even people who are not Christians usually have things to say about Jesus that are at least flattering, even if they are not giving him his full glory that he deserves. So yes, these men are unworthy even to stand in the presence of Christ by anyone's standards. And yet here they are here they are presuming to judge him, and Jesus has to endure their mock justice throughout his trial. So let's just lay that out there and just say this is evidence that that's what kind of men these are. They are lesser men standing in judgment over someone who should be judging them. Now, in case you want further proof of the vice and the corruption of these men, I can say this. These men violated ancient standards of justice. And this is one of my phrases that I deliberately chose. Again, ancient standards of justice. We already know that the trial of Jesus was unjust by modern standards. Anyone today that has anything to do with courts of law reads this and be like, this is a trial? Are you kidding me? This is like a bunch of vigilantes or a posse. There's that word again. This is like mock justice here. So by modern standards, it's certainly not justice. But what I want to argue is that the trial of Jesus was unjust by ancient Jewish standards as well. That even people back then would look at this and say, really? That's what happened. Now, I'm about to refer, as I often have, to the Mishnah, which I've produced this book on a few different occasions. I like my antiquated Jewish literature and trying to study the Bible in light of that, so I know that we're reading things the way that they would have been understood by people back then. That's the whole point of that. The Mishnah specifically, this is the written form of the Jewish traditions that were developing at around the time of Jesus. So anytime you see the Pharisees talk about the traditions of the elders, they're talking about this kind of stuff. It just wasn't written down yet. Now it is. And we can actually read some of their written traditions. Now, the Mishnah contains a great deal about public justice. All right? And along those same lines, the Mishnah contains a lot about the Sanhedrin court in particular. There is a chapter in the Mishnah called the Sanhedrin. Like there is a specific portion talking about how this court was supposed to function. So we can kind of look at that and see how they were supposed to be conducting their business. Now, as I've often said, it can be difficult to know how old any of these traditions are. The Mishnah itself was written down in about the year 200, so you've got a few centuries there of oral tradition developing before it's finally written down. Jesus certainly lived during that time, and there are certainly things that I've showed you before that the Jews were doing and saying that match things written down by the Mishnah, but placing any one of them in particular, like when the Jews started doing this particular thing, that can be a little difficult. So we can't ever make for the most part, like an airtight argument from the Mishnah. However, what I can say for sure is this, and this is the big thing I want to talk about. The grandsons of the men who murdered Jesus would have rebuked their grandfathers for conducting a trial the way they did. And perhaps even their sons would have rebuked them, and maybe even their brothers would have rebuked them. So we can at least say that. In a time not too far removed from Jesus, there were Jews teaching and writing down, this is how you should conduct a trial, and it goes completely against what we see in the trial of Jesus. And I'm going through all of this because we sometimes grade people in the past on a curve, and we say, well, back then people thought differently, back then people did things differently, we can't judge them by modern standards. Well, maybe not, but we can judge them by their own standards. And it wasn't so long after this event that people started writing down things about how public justice should happen, and it is entirely different than what we see in the trial of Jesus. So I think the observations I'm about to make are very fair in terms of just, trashing these guys who dared presume to stand in judgment over Christ. With that in mind, we can say that the trial of Jesus broke the standards of justice in 3 ways. And you could divide these up in any number of ways, but hey, 3 is a good number, right? Just like 7. So 3 is a good number. So they broke the standards of justice in 3 ways. First, in trials concerning the death penalty, someone in the Sanhedrin was required to make a defense for the accused, and in fact, the trial was supposed to begin with the defense of the accused. All right? So there's supposed to be arrangements made for someone to stand up and argue why we should not execute this man. Where is Jesus' defense attorney in any of the accounts we have? Is there anyone arguing against his execution? There isn't anyone. They don't care. They're just trying to find reasons to condemn this guy. They don't care one bit about providing him a chance to defend himself or arranging for someone of their number to defend him. Secondly, no death sentence was allowed to be handed down at night, nor was it allowed to be handed down on the same day as the trial, nor could the death sentence be handed down on the eve of a festival like Passover or the unleavened bread. And in the case of Jesus, they just ignored all of these rules. Now, the idea behind all that, not at night, not on the same day as the trial, not on the eve of a festival, the mentality behind that is they want to make sure they have time to think about what they're doing. If we're going to kill this guy, let's make sure we've got it right. So don't do it at night when you're tired. Don't do it on the same day when you don't have time to think about it. And don't do it on the eve of a festival because we're all making preparations for the holidays and we're all busy. Let's do it after the holidays are over. Like, that's the basic mentality. These guys, kill him now. We've decided, doesn't matter if it's night, doesn't matter if we've been at this all night, doesn't matter if we're all getting ready for the Passover, none of that matters. Let's just do it. Let's put him to death. So there's a violation. Finally, trials could be held in only one of 3 places. 1, the Temple Mount. 3, the Temple Court. 3, what am I doing here? I got right to the 3 because that's a good number, right? 1, the Temple Mount. 2, the Temple Courtyard. And then the 3rd is the Chamber of Hewn Stone, which is not a structure that we know a lot about, but we know that it was the location of the highest, it's the kind of like the highest public place for these trials to take place. If anything was the courthouse in Jerusalem at that time, it was the Chamber of Hewn Stone. In other words, meeting at somebody's house, even if it was the house of the high priest, was forbidden for a trial. You can't, have the trial in the judge's backyard, for example, which, by the way, is exactly what they're doing. I don't know if you noticed that, but if we back up and reread something we read before, Matthew 26, let's start reading again, verse 57. There you go. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered it and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Where is this trial happening? The courtyard of the high priest. Not the temple, not the Temple Mount, not the chamber of hewn stone. They took him to the high priest's house, to his backyard, the courtyard. That's where they're having this trial. Again, this is off the books. I mean, this is not the way you're supposed to do things. Imagine, again, the police come to get you out of your jail cell to go to your trial, and you pass the courthouse and you go to some guy's backyard. No, that's not how justice works. And it's not how justice was supposed to work back then either. But that's what they're doing. So Jesus is totally robbed of justice here. Even according to ancient Jewish standards, there's no one there to defend him. The council rushed its judgment about his execution, and they met in secret rather than in a place of public business. This is what we commonly call, and we overuse the word, but in this case it fits, a travesty of justice. And so the most righteous man in history bore the humiliation of enduring this mock justice of these corrupt lawbreakers. I mean, these are the men who are supposed to be upholding the law in the highest possible sense there in Jerusalem. They're breaking all of their own rules, or at least the rules that would eventually come to be defined among the Jews as the way public justice should work. But of course, this again has application to what Christians face through all time and even into our very day. We've lived to see our own justice system, being distorted for the purposes of suppressing the gospel and retaliating against Christians who dare to live like Christians. Every now and then, if you're reading the news, there's some Christian that tried to apply their teachings to their jobs, to their lives. Someone got angry and sued them. Some bureaucrat showed up with an arrest warrant, yada, yada. It's the same thing over and over again. And the public justice system is very much used against us in these ways. Now, in other parts of the world, that injustice has been happening for much longer. We're scandalized by it because for us, it's a fairly new thing here in the United States. In other countries, that's been the past, 2,000 years? So it's no big change for them. Nonetheless, for us, it's all very shocking and very degrading as we have to go through that sometimes. And as for the perpetrators of that injustice, what sort of people are they? Well, they're the people in power, right? They're the ones that actually have the power and control over the courts and those kinds of things, and they're the ones able to make all of this happen. And the very fact is, among the public servants of our own day, there are very few of them that are actually God's servants. And so, we find ourselves not very well represented in places of power anymore. And standing up against all of that can be wearisome and disheartening. It's the kind of thing that can cause a lot of anxiety, can cause a lot of impatience, we might say. But if we ever find ourselves subjected to that kind of thing, to some kind of fake justice, we can remember, first of all, that Christ himself endured the same thing. That was very much how his trial operated. They just threw the law book out the window and did what they wanted to do. But we can also remember that Jesus triumphed over all of that, not just in his resurrection, but in the victory of his very name. I mean, just ruling out for a moment the resurrection itself, the name of Jesus has triumphed against the names of all these men, to the point where most of them have been forgotten, and the ones that are remembered as villains. History has a way of vindicating things in the long run. So we can look to that, have some assurance, and we can look beyond that to an even greater assurance, the ultimate victory of God. Just like he gave Christ ultimate victory, we also can have that too. And we can maintain the same amount of faith and patience that Jesus had during his trial, despite the utter corruption of justice that very often gets leveled against Christians, even in our own time and place. So we can remember that as we remember him and follow his example and his patience throughout all these things. Well, finally, let's talk about how Christ was humiliated by slander. And I gave you a definition of slander earlier. Slander is when people make up lies about you and tell those lies to as many people as possible. They know it's a lie, but hey, they want to hurt you, so they're going to talk about you in this way anyway. That's slander. Now, the trial of Jesus was entirely based around slander. We can read here again at verse 59. The chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. They did not find any, although many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" Now, I plan to do a separate sermon on that bit of testimony about the temple and why those men said that and whether Christ had taught anything like that. It's the kind of thing that deserves its own sermon, so I'm going to give it its own sermon. I don't plan to talk about that too much right now. For now, I just want to focus on the false testimony, the slander being leveled against Jesus at his trial. No one likes lies being spread about them. Some of you that are maybe in school, I don't know if you've encountered that yet, but school is a great place to slander people, and it used to happen very often whenever I was in school. I'm sure those of you that have endured that do not like that and are very much crushed by it whenever it happens. And Jesus is enduring that, and he has to sit there and endure it because, hey, this is his trial, right? And these are the people in power. And, we can talk even further about the actual physical violence done against him at the end of his trial. Getting there, that's even worse. It's just like step down, step down, step down. You're paraded before all the dignitaries. They're totally corrupting justice against you. They're slandering you. Now they're hitting you in the face. My goodness, just down, down, down it goes. Where Jesus is just being absolutely humiliated in every way imaginable at this time, including these false witnesses. It's just amazing. Now, in being slandered by these false witnesses, it's worth pointing out that Jesus assumes a very biblical role in all of this, and that is the role, we might say, of the righteous sufferer. And if you've read the Psalms, as some of you I know have read the Psalms very recently, this actually comes up quite a bit. Just to give you one example of what I'm talking about, this is Psalm 27, we're jumping in the middle here, but verses 11 through 14 of Psalm 27. Just briefly, here's what, this is a Psalm of David, so here's what he says. "Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a level path because of my foes. Do not deliver me over to the desire of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such as breathe out violence. I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord." Now, again, trying to think about what Jesus might be thinking about while all this is happening, I have to believe that Psalm 27 was somewhere in there, because it's the kind of thing written for his exact situation. And he is very much living out the role of the righteous sufferer, someone who is righteous, but is being treated as wicked and just absolutely destroyed by his enemies. And the enemies of Christ seem unaware that they are, by their actions, casting him in that role of the righteous, patient man trusting in God. They're not the ones playing that part, that's for sure. They're just dogpiling on this guy, and he's just taking it silently. His patience here is truly remarkable and just astonishing to them. But that's all their fault for casting him in that role. They've actually created a part of what we talk about with Jesus, just his righteousness and his patience despite his suffering and how much he went through. So we should remember that about Christ, and people do remember that about Christ most of all, whereas we remember the Sanhedrin as a bunch of liars and cowards for what they did. We have to do more than remember that and more than observe it. We have to imitate it. We have to imitate the kinds of things that we see Jesus doing. As I talk about this, I usually like to also address something else about this that I just find fascinating. Just the degree of it, how much righteousness he must have had at that time for his trial to play out the way it did. Did you notice that even the false testimony against Jesus doesn't actually work? The way they word it here in this passage. I got to get back to the passage. Try again. There we go. So, the whole council was trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. How does that work? How do you have people that are deliberately trying to lie against you, and it still doesn't stick. It should be relatively easy. I mean, if you really wanted to find somebody to create, slander, false testimony against you, it can be done. I want to read you a passage. As I talk about this, I always think of this passage when I come to the trial of Jesus. I want to read from 1 Kings 21. You can turn there if you want. I'm going to give you a crash course in what's happening, but you can turn there if you desire. 1 Kings chapter 21, I'll start reading in verse 8. But in this passage, what we see is another righteous man, and his name is Naboth. Okay? Naboth. Now, Naboth had a wonderful vineyard. And a vineyard is a place where you grow grapes so you can make wine. Okay? So very productive. Vineyards are usually high dollar things. Naboth has a great vineyard. Now, King Ahab, one of Israel's most wicked kings, he wants that vineyard. It's not enough for him to have the whole kingdom. He's got to have this guy's vineyard too. He really wants that vineyard. But Naboth refuses to sell it to him because the law of Moses actually forbids transferring land from one family to another. So Naboth rightly says, I think he says, God forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab gets all pouty because Ahab is not exactly the most inspiring king either that Israel ever had, but he gets all pouty and he doesn't like how this happened. And then Ahab's wife comes in, a woman named Jezebel, and she has a plan to get the vineyard. Okay, so here's her plan. We're going to read her plan and how it worked. This is again 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 8 through 15. And even I'm not there. Okay, here we go. Starting in verse 8. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal and sent letters to the elders and to the nobles who were living with Naboth in his city. Now she wrote in the letters saying, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the people, and seat 2 worthless men before him, and let them testify against him, saying, you cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. So the men of his city, the elders and the nobles who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as it was written in the letters which she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the head of the people. Then 2 worthless men came in and sat before him, and the worthless men testified against him, even against Naboth, before the people, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent word to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. Then Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead. And Jezebel said to Ahab, arise and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money. For Naboth is not alive, but dead. Now I read you that passage to show you just how easy it was for a righteous man to be executed based on false testimony, especially when rulers are involved. One letter from a queen to the nobles and elders of one city got this guy killed over his vineyard. And he's a righteous man. Everything about him sounds good and above board as we read about him. How is it that it turns out so differently in the case of Jesus? Despite all the false witnesses coming forward, none of what was actually testified led to his execution. I can't even imagine the scene. How clean do you have to be that even false testimony just falls off of you? Like people want to kill you and they want to create some charge against you. And a bunch of people stand up and say, well, he said this, he did that. And everyone's just like, no, I don't think so. Like what? How? How does that happen? The only thing that led to his death was his own true testimony about himself. That's how it plays out as we read the actual trial of Jesus. The high priest stood up and said to him, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. The high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of testimony or witnesses? Behold, you have heard now the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, he deserves death. So it's only when Jesus tells the truth about himself that they actually decide to kill him. But the false testimony, they're just like, we don't need that anymore. Forget all that stuff. Oh, the temple, forget about the temple. He said this, we're going to kill him for that. How does that even work? It's amazing to me that Jesus was that righteous or had that much presence that the only man that could effectively get him executed was him, telling the truth and not a bunch of people trying to lie about him. It's amazing to me. Nonetheless, Jesus still had to stand there and listen to his good name be dragged down by false witnesses, lie after lie after lie, while his life was on the line, which is never easy. I mean, he stood there silently taking that whole thing. I mean, if it were us, we'd be like, hey, now, wait a minute. You have half the story. Let me tell you what really happened. Like, that's how we respond to that. Jesus, he's not saying anything. He just lets it happen. Now, of all the ways that we can imitate Christ, this is perhaps the one most available to us, whether we like it or not. It's the one situation in which we are probably most likely to find ourselves. We don't often come up against judges and governors. We don't often, have to deal with an actual legal process being distorted. But slander, false testimony, misunderstanding, those things are fairly common. Because Christians earn the hatred of the world simply by being Christians, and since slander is the quick and easy way for our enemies to hurt us, Christians have often been slandered, both as a group and as individuals. It's very common. The good news is we know by the example of Christ that a moment of slander does not lead to an eternity of shame. Right? Just there in that moment when people are lying about you, that does not define your future. And it certainly does not define your future forever. If nothing else, God intends to balance the scales of justice in the age to come, and all reputations will be restored at that time. There's coming a day when God will call out his court, and everyone's going to stand there. And God's going to stand up certain people and say, this is true of this person. This is false about this person. And everyone's going to know the truth of every matter. But even in this life, we have reason to hope. We don't have to wait for Judgment Day. All right? We have reason to hope right here, right now. Today, people don't remember Jesus according to the false testimony about him. And if the four Gospels are to be believed, we don't even remember the false testimony. Like we have this one little statement about the temple, which is kind of based on things he said, but not exactly. The actual false testimony, who cares? Today, people call Jesus Lord and God, the Savior of the world, the Good Shepherd, the Good Teacher, the Physician of souls. What happened to all the slander? Where's all the false testimony? It's evaporated. Even in this wicked age, slander does not endure. Truth wins out is the saying we often have, and that is certainly true in the case of Jesus. It is also true in our case. And I'll say this, the best way, based on the example of Jesus, the best way to overcome slander is to live in such a way that no one could ever believe the slander against you, which is a tall order. I mean, I was just amazed earlier when I was talking about how even false testimony didn't stick to Jesus, and it just shows how righteous he was. It's a tall order to live up to that kind of standard, but if you can actually manage to be wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove, then even false testimony isn't really going to work against you. Righteousness, as Paul has observed elsewhere, is like a breastplate. It's like armor. It protects you in more ways than one. For people that are truly living that kind of life, the more they actually live it, the less people are actually likely to believe the slander against you. So if we have to endure the humiliation of slander as Jesus did, let's at least endure it the way he did, as a righteous sufferer, as someone who is just patiently enduring it, trusting in God, and not letting it affect him in the way that it might, in the way that I think our instincts very much make it affect us. I thought of this passage. This is the last passage I have to read today. This is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better, if God should will it, that you should suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. You know, it's only slander if it's not true. If you've actually done the bad things people are saying about you, you've kind of earned it. But if you're a righteous person and people hate you for your righteousness, the shame is on them for all the bad things they say about you. Make that happen. Make sure that's the way it turns out. That's what Jesus basically defamed all of his accusers by his own silence and his own righteousness in his trial. Do that yourself. Live in that way. Be righteous as he was, be patient as he was, and let the truth win out in its time. All right. Well, again, I called this sermon The Patience of the Saints because I was hoping to provoke you all by the example of Christ to be like him and to be patient as he was during his trial. So, in talking about the humiliation of Christ during his trial, I was trying to talk about his patient endurance, and I think I did that. Let's go through these things one more time, just to give you a quick outline, and then we'll be done. So first of all, I said that Christ was humiliated by all the dignitaries in Jerusalem. I said he was humiliated by the lesser men judging him and humiliated by the slander. And through all of that, he maintained silence because he's patiently enduring and letting these things play out. And in that, he's an example for us to follow as we endure similar situations. Well, next time, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about next time, I want to talk about what should not be such a hard thing, but which has become a very weighty topic, the concept of the Son of God. When Caiaphas puts Jesus under oath and says, "I adjure you, tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God," that is actually a very loaded question. And I want to spend a sermon talking about that in particular, and it will kind of be the common thread for most of the following sermons on this passage. So I want to spend some time on that, and that's what I'll do next time I preach, which I believe is a couple weeks from now. So until then, are there questions about things I've shared today, or any comments or observations that anyone had on these things?